So picture this, right? An American F-35 fighter jet.
Right.
It's a machine that costs, roughly $100 million. It's engineered to be practically invisible. I mean, the absolute pinnacle of Western air superiority.
The best of the best.
Exactly. So this jet pulls into a secured hangar in Jordan. The pilot cuts the engine. The massive, reinforced steel doors of the bunker just slide shut.
Safe and sound?
Right. You would think in that specific moment, this asset is completely safe. It's closed from the world, heavily guarded, entirely off the grid.
But it's not.
No, because seconds later, literally seconds after those doors close, a highly precise ballistic missile drops from the sky and just completely obliterates the structure. Everything inside is gone.
Yeah, and it's that timing, right? That timing is what makes the image so jarring.
It really is.
Because we aren't talking about a lucky strike here or, a barrage of dumbfire where one just happens to hit a target. We are talking about zero latency.
It's terrifying because a strike like that, it isn't just about the explosive payload.
No, not at all.
It completely shatters the illusion of invulnerability. It tells us that the old rules of global conflict, the paradigms of technological supremacy we've relied on for decades, they've fundamentally changed.
The gap has closed.
Right. The gap is closed.
It absolutely has. And to pull off a strike with that level of precision, you need real-time, exquisite intelligence.
You have to be watching.
Exactly. You need to be watching a live feed, calculating the trajectory, and executing a ballistic launch with a margin of error measured in milliseconds.
Which is insane.
It is. It requires an entirely different class of warfare capability than what we are used to seeing from adversaries in that region.
So today, we're doing a deep dive into a deeply chilling assessment of exactly that capability and, what it means for the world.
We've got some heavy material today.
We really do. We're looking at a very dense, highly alarming geopolitical conversation between two prominent voices. We've got analyst Glenn Deason and Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson.
And just for some quick context on Wilkerson, he's the former chief of staff to the U.S. Secretary of State under Colin Powell.
Right.
So he spent decades deep inside the American military and diplomatic machine.
Yeah, he knows the system inside and out. And their joint assessment of the escalating tensions between the U.S. and Iran suggests that, those tensions are not just regional flare-ups anymore.
No, they're seeing it as the catalyst for a cascading global crisis.
Exactly. But right out of the gate, we really have to establish a very clear baseline for this conversation with you, the listener.
Yes, this is crucial.
The analysis provided by Deason and Wilkerson pulls absolutely no punches.
Run.
They are presenting highly charged, controversial, and frankly deeply critical views of American leadership. And this isn't partisan in the traditional sense either.
Right. They level severe criticism of political figures across both major U.S. parties.
Yep.
As well as current military leadership. And they're also intensely critical of foreign allies, specifically calling out the policies of Israel and Saudi Arabia.
Which is why we need to make this vital distinction right now. Our role here in this deep dive is not to endorse their politics, validate their specific worldviews, or take any sides.
Exactly. We are completely impartial here.
We are acting strictly as your guides. We're just mapping out the architecture of their argument, right?
Yeah.
Mapping out why they believe the current global order is on the brink of collapse so that you can understand this specific, very forceful geopolitical perspective.
We're delivering their analysis exactly as it exists in the source text.
Right. Because regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum, understanding how seasoned insiders like Wilkerson view the breakdown of U.S. strategy, it's crucial to making sense of all the chaos we're seeing on the global stage right now.
It really is. You can't ignore voices with that much institutional history.
So, looking at this first argument about Iran's actual capabilities, I'm just struck by the massive disconnect between what Wilkerson is saying and what we normally see on the evening news.
Oh, it's night and day.
Whenever I turn on the television, the dominant narrative is that Iran is this nation crumbling from within, right?
You hear about protests.
Exactly. Massive protests, a fractured government, a failing economy. We always hear about the hardliners battling the moderates.
Yeah, that's the standard talking point.
But the source text paints a completely different picture.
It does. Wilkerson completely rejects that Western narrative of an internally fractured Iran.
Totally throws it out.
He characterizes them as resolute, strategic, and determined. He basically argues that from a geopolitical and military standpoint, there is no meaningful division over there.
Wow.
Yeah, he says there's no distinction right now between the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, the regular military, and the Guardian Council.
So they're all on the same page.
Exactly. He views them as moving as a single, unified entity. As he puts it, it's Persia, 93 million strong.
93 million people unified under a single strategic vision. I mean, that changes the entire calculus of how you approach a conflict.
It changes everything.
And that unity is backed by some very serious hardware, which, brings us back to that F-35 hangar in Jordan.
Right.
How exactly does Iran execute a strike like that? Do they have their own constellation of spy satellites that we just don't know about?
Well, they don't necessarily need their own. This is where the geopolitical alliances really come into play.
Okay.
Wilkerson assesses that Iran is utilizing highly sophisticated targeting backed by external powers. He points specifically to Chinese satellites.
Wow.
And potentially Russian backup systems as well.
So China is basically providing the eyes.
Exactly. China's Beidou navigation satellite system is incredibly advanced. And if Iran has access to that network, or even a specialized military feed from it, they have real-time visibility.
That's a game changer.
It is.
Yeah.
Because to hit a hangar the exact second a jet is secured, it means someone, somewhere, is feeding them a live, high-resolution feed of American military movements.
It's like playing a high-stakes game of poker against someone who has a hacked live feed of your cards.
That's exactly what it is.
You can't bluff. You can't hide your chips. They know exactly what you're holding, and they know exactly when you're looking the other way.
That is a perfect way to conceptualize it. And because they can see the cards, Iran is playing a very calculated game. They aren't just lashing out randomly.
Right.
According to Wilkerson, Iran has meticulously constructed multiple tiers of target lists across the Middle East.
Tiers, like an escalating scale.
Exactly. They have hit the first tier, which is tactical military targets. They have selectively hit targets on the second tier. But here is the detail that should keep people up at night.
What's that?
They are deliberately holding back on their third, fourth, and fifth tier targets.
Wait, what exactly is on a fourth or fifth tier target list? We aren't talking about a military basis anymore, are we?
No. We are talking about the jugular veins of the global economy.
Oh, wow.
Wilkerson specifically points to places like Fujairah in the United Arab Emirates and facilities in Yanbu, Saudi Arabia.
Okay, let's pause and explain Fujairah for a second, because it's not exactly a household name, but it is absolutely critical.
It's very critical.
Fujairah is an emirate on the eastern coast of the UAE, facing the Gulf of Oman. And why does that matter to you? Because the UAE built a massive pipeline to pump their oil across the desert to Fujairah, specifically so they wouldn't have to send their oil tankers through the Strait of Hormuz.
Which Iran controls.
Right. So Fujairah is essentially the West's emergency failsafe.
Precisely. It is the bypass valve for global energy.
Yeah.
So if Iran decides to launch a barrage of precision ballistic missiles at the oil terminals in Fujairah or, the petrochemical complexes in Yanbu, they aren't just blowing up oil fields.
They're severing the backup plans.
Yes. Wilkerson is incredibly blunt here. He says if Iran hits those higher tier targets, it instantly throws the world into a global economic depression.
Which raises a massive glaring question here.
Right.
If Iran has this technological advantage, right? If they have this live feed of the poker game, and they are currently facing off against an adversary like the United States that they are actively hostile toward, why pump the brakes?
That's a good question.
Why hold back from crippling the West's economy?
Because of what Wilkerson calls the sympathy strategy.
Sympathy strategy?
Yeah. Iran and the strategic minds running their policy, they do not want to lose global support. You have to look outside the Western bubble for a second.
Let's zoom out.
The source cites recent global polling indicating that roughly 2/3 of the world views China as a positive entity.
Wow.
Meanwhile, a similar percentage views the United States as the greatest threat to the future of the globe.
The numbers they cite in the text are just wild. They say over 90% of Pakistanis view the U.S. negatively.
Yeah.
And over 50% of people under 40 in South Korea, which, is supposed to be one of America's staunchest allies in Asia, they view the U.S. as a major threat.
Right. So Iran is playing a much longer, much more sophisticated geopolitical game.
Because if they hit Fujairah.
Exactly. If they unilaterally blow up the global economy by hitting Fujairah, they instantly become the villain in the eyes of the global South.
Right. Everyone hurts.
African nations, Asian nations, South American nations, everyone suffers if the energy markets collapse.
Yeah.
But by holding back, by enduring some tactical strikes from the U.S. and Israel, and by selectively demonstrating their own precision without causing a global depression, Iran maintains its geopolitical alignment.
So they basically get to look like the rational actors in the room.
Exactly. They maintain their ties with Russia, China, and the broader BRICS nations while simultaneously isolating the United States on the world stage.
Okay, so if Iran is playing this highly disciplined, long-term strategic game, how does Wilkerson portray the United States leadership in this scenario? I mean, are they matching this level of calculation?
The contrast is stark, to put it mildly.
Oh, boy.
Wilkerson, drawing on his decades in Washington, he describes current U.S. leadership as entirely reactionary.
Just reacting to whatever happens.
Yes. He specifically cites Donald Trump in the context of previous administrations and current political influence, and advisors like Pete Hegseth. But he applies this critique broadly across the modern political establishment. He sees them as disorganized, completely disconnected from the reality on the ground, and relying on brute force, literally dropping bombs, rather than executing any kind of coherent, long-term strategy.
He argues they're basically operating under the delusion that they can just bomb Iran into submission.
Yeah.
Completely ignoring the fact that Iran is actively absorbing the blows while holding the winning economic hand.
And here is where the text brings in a historical parallel that is deeply, deeply illuminating.
Okay.
Wilkerson references the political scientist John Mearsheimer, who draws a direct comparison between the current U.S. strategy and the strategy of President Lyndon B. Johnson during the Vietnam War.
Okay, I really want to dig into this because, the Vietnam comparison gets thrown around a lot.
It does.
But Mearsheimer and Wilkerson are pointing to a very specific mechanical trap that LBJ fell into.
Right. It's not just a vague comparison about being in a messy war. It's about domestic political captivity.
Explain that.
So if you look at the historical record, LBJ knew, privately, that bombing North Vietnam was not going to win the war.
He knew it wasn't working.
The defense establishment knew it. The intelligence agencies knew it. But LBJ was completely trapped by the domestic political environment of the mid-1960s.
Because he had inherited the presidency after Kennedy's assassination, and he had this massive, sweeping domestic agenda, the Great Society.
Exactly.
We were talking about the Civil Rights Act, Medicare, Medicaid, these huge anti-poverty programs.
Right. And LBJ knew that if he was perceived by his political opponents, specifically the hawkish conservatives and the Dixiecrats, as quote-unquote cutting and running from communism in Vietnam,
they'd be painted as weak.
He would be painted as incredibly weak. And if he looked weak on national security, he would lose all his political capital, and his entire domestic legacy, the Great Society, would be dead on arrival in Congress.
Wow. So what did he do?
He knowingly doubled down on a losing military strategy. He sent hundreds of thousands of troops into a meat grinder, not to win a military victory, but to protect his political flank at home.
That is a staggering parallel. So what the source is arguing is that current U.S. leadership, regardless of which party is in the White House, is caught in the exact same trap.
The exact same trap.
They are facing a hyper-polarized, highly volatile domestic political situation. The institutional apparatus, the Pentagon, the State Department, they likely know that dropping more bombs on Iranian proxies isn't solving the core strategic problem.
They know it's not working.
But politically, they cannot afford the optics of looking weak on Iran. They cannot admit that the policy has failed because it would be electoral suicide.
So they double down, they launch more airstrikes, they send more carrier strike groups.
Just flexing.
Yeah, they engage in these performative displays of military might that do absolutely nothing to change the strategic reality, all just to appease a domestic audience.
I have to challenge the premise here, though.
Go for it.
Let's look at this objectively. If Wilkerson is right, and Iran has this massive China-backed technological advantage and incredible strategic patience, while the U.S. is trapped in a domestic political doom loop, flailing blindly, why hasn't this erupted into a full-scale, all-out regional war yet? If the U.S. is that vulnerable and Iran is that strong, are they just locked in a terrifying game of chicken?
It's a great question, but the framing of a full-scale war is precisely what Wilkerson is arguing against here.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the source implies that it hasn't erupted into a full-scale regional war because Iran is dictating the tempo. Yeah. Iran doesn't actually need a full-scale regional war to achieve its grand strategic objectives.
Because that would be too messy.
Exactly. A massive conventional war is messy, it's unpredictable, and it risks nuclear escalation.
So what are they doing instead?
What Iran is doing, according to this analysis, is executing a strategy of slow suffocation.
Slow suffocation.
Yeah. They are degrading the U.S. presence, bleeding them economically, and isolating them diplomatically, all while staying just beneath the threshold that would force a massive American conventional response.
Ah, I see.
As you pointed out earlier, Iran is winning by not fully fighting on the military battlefield.
Winning by not fighting. Because the true battlefield, the place where Iran and its allies are actually applying the pressure, isn't a military base in Jordan.
No, it's not.
It's the global shipping lanes, which means we really need to look at a map. For decades, American strategic obsession in the Middle East has been hyper-focused on one specific body of water, the Persian Gulf.
Specifically the Strait of Hormuz.
Right.
That narrow choke point at the bottom of the Gulf. That was where the oil was. That was where the carrier strike groups patrolled. It was literally the center of the geopolitical universe.
But Deason and Wilkerson argue that paradigm is completely dead.
Dead and gone.
The Persian Gulf is no longer the center of gravity.
Not anymore. Wilkerson details this massive tabletop war game, a highly detailed simulation conducted a few years ago at the Peace Institute in Washington, D.C.
And we should clarify for everyone listening, this wasn't just a couple of academics moving pieces on a board.
No, no, no. This was the highest level of institutional heavy hitters.
Who is there?
You had representatives from the U.S. European Command, you had NATO brass, you had global maritime administrations, and crucially, you had the massive global insurers like AIG and Lloyd's of London sitting right alongside the major international shipping conglomerates.
So the people who actually run the world's logistics.
And everyone who has a vested multi-billion-dollar stake in global logistics was in that room. And the question they were tasked with answering was pretty simple. Has the Red Sea officially surpassed the Persian Gulf as the strategic cockpit of competition in the region?
And what was the consensus?
It was an overwhelming, unanimous yes.
Wow.
Across both the military and civilian sectors. The Red Sea is now vastly more important to worldwide commodity traffic and global economic stability.
I mean, the numbers in the source text are just staggering. They note that 60% of the world's commodities pass through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal.
60%.
We are talking about bulk foodstuffs, grain, oil, liquefied natural gas, and an endless stream of consumer goods manufactured in Asia heading to European and American markets.
Think about the magnitude of that for a second.
It's hard to wrap your head around.
60% of the physical stuff the world needs to survive flows through this one narrow corridor between Yemen and the Horn of Africa.
It's like, imagine you've spent the last 40 years obsessively guarding the front door of your house.
Okay.
You've installed titanium deadbolts, security cameras, and hired armed guards to stand on the porch.
Yeah.
You firmly believe that front door, which is the Persian Gulf, is the most critical vulnerability you have.
Right.
Only to suddenly realize that all of your actual food, your drinking water, your medicine, and your electricity gets delivered through a small kitchen window at the back of the house.
And that's the Red Sea.
That kitchen window is the Red Sea. And right now, someone is actively boarding up that window while your guards are still staring at the front door.
That is exactly what is happening in real time. And the group boarding up the window are the Houthis in Yemen.
Acting in alignment with Iran.
Exactly. Acting in alignment with Iran's broader strategy of suffocation. Wilkerson points out that the Houthis have effectively shut down this route for Western-aligned shipping.
Yeah.
He notes that the port of Eilat in Israel is essentially non-operational. It has been economically devastated because ships simply cannot reach it.
But let's explain the mechanics of this blockade, because I think a lot of people wonder, how can a rebel group in Yemen shut down the mighty U.S. Navy and all these global shipping conglomerates? Don't we have destroyers protecting these ships?
We do, but it comes down to asymmetric math.
Okay.
And the math is horrifyingly bad for the United States.
How so?
The Houthis are utilizing relatively cheap, mass-produced technology. They are firing Iranian-designed Shahed drones that might cost $20,000 to $50,000 to manufacture.
Which is nothing in military terms.
Right. They're using anti-ship ballistic missiles that are also inexpensive in military terms.
And how does the U.S. Navy respond to that?
Well, the U.S. Navy destroyers in the Red Sea use the Aegis combat system.
Okay.
To shoot down a $20,000 drone, an American destroyer fires a Standard Missile-2, an SM-2, which cost roughly $2.1 million per shot.
Wait, $2 million to shoot down a $20,000 drone?
Yes.
That's unsustainable.
Completely. And a destroyer only carries a finite number of those missiles in its vertical launch tubes. Once they are empty, the ship has to leave the combat zone and sail to a friendly port to reload, which takes weeks.
Oh, wow.
So the Houthis don't have to sink a U.S. aircraft carrier to win. They just have to exhaust the interceptor missiles and make the waters too statistically dangerous for commercial ships.
Because of the insurance, right?
Exactly. Because once the risk reaches a certain threshold, the maritime insurance markets in London simply refuse to insure the cargo. And if a ship isn't insured, it doesn't sail. The Houthis have basically weaponized insurance algorithms.
That is brilliant and terrifying. So what is the alternative? I mean, oceans are vast. Can't these massive container ships just take a detour?
They can, but the economic cost of that detour is catastrophic.
How bad?
The War Game at the Peace Institute looked at other historical maritime choke points. Take the Strait of Malacca in Southeast Asia.
Okay.
When they war gamed the Strait of Malacca closing due to a conflict, they found logistical workarounds. It was disruptive, sure, but manageable.
Right, you just sail around the islands.
Yeah, ships could navigate different routes through the Indonesian archipelago and still get products to market with a slight delay. But the Red Sea geography is unforgiving.
It's a dead end if you can't go through the canal.
Exactly. If you cannot transit the Red Sea and the Suez Canal, your only option is to sail all the way south, around the Cape of Good Hope at the bottom of Africa, and then all the way back up the Atlantic.
Adding thousands of miles, weeks of transit time, and literally millions of dollars in fuel costs to every single shipment.
Exactly. And Wilkerson predicts this creates a cascading, compounding global impact. He warns of dire immediate consequences if this blockade becomes a permanent feature of the global economy.
Like what? What are we looking at?
He explicitly talks about the U.S. running out of diesel fuel within 30 days of a total logistical breakdown.
30 days. Diesel. And we aren't just talking about premium gas for sports cars. Diesel is the lifeblood of the physical economy.
It is the economy.
It runs every long-haul truck, every freight train, every tractor on every farm in the country.
Right. And without diesel, agricultural supply chains collapse almost immediately. You cannot harvest crops. You cannot transport food to grocery stores.
It's a nightmare scenario.
And furthermore, Wilkerson points out that if the shipping lanes are compromised, the U.S. wouldn't be able to import the rare earth metals and highly specialized components from China that are required for domestic defense production.
Wait. So the U.S. relies on Chinese components to build its own weapons?
Heavily.
That's insane.
The irony is staggering. Wilkerson states that if this supply chain breaks, you literally cannot build the weapons you need to fight the war you are currently engaged in. The defense industrial base just grinds to a halt.
Wow. So I want you, the listener, to really think about this for a second. This isn't just distant military theory happening in a Pentagon war room.
No, it hits home.
This is the source explaining exactly why the price of your groceries, your electronics, and the fuel in your car could skyrocket overnight.
Yep.
If 60% of global commodities have to suddenly take a massive multi-week detour around the African continent, the inflation we've seen over the last few years will look like a mild warm-up act. We are talking about systemic economic shock.
We really are. And here is the ultimate geopolitical irony of this entire situation.
What's that?
This maritime blockade, which the U.S. is bleeding treasure to try and break, unintentionally supercharges the global power of America's primary strategic rival.
Which is China.
China.
Explain that mechanism. How does chaos in the Red Sea actually help Beijing?
It comes down to the shift from maritime power to land power.
Okay.
For centuries, global dominance has been dictated by whoever controls the oceans. First the British Empire, then the American Empire.
Rule the waves, rule the world.
Right. But if the oceans become too expensive, too dangerous, and too unpredictable for reliable commercial shipping, land routes become king.
Ah, I see where this is going.
Wilkerson explicitly points out that this maritime chaos in the Red Sea gives massive, immediate impetus to the international railroad networks that China has been painstakingly building over the last decade.
We are talking about the Belt and Road Initiative.
Exactly. The Belt and Road. China has established these direct rail links stretching all the way from manufacturing hubs like Yiwu across Central Asia into Russia and terminating in places like Madrid and London.
I remember reading about those trains. They bypass the oceans entirely.
They do. And if maritime economic power wanes because the U.S. Navy can no longer guarantee the safety of the sea lanes, land-based economic power rises.
And China owns the rails.
China owns the rails. Wilkerson suggests this shift in the balance of logistical power is a secondary but incredibly profound reason why the U.S. is struggling so hard in its Iran strategy.
How so?
Well, the U.S. is fighting desperately to keep the sea lanes open to maintain the maritime world order. But by failing to decisively defeat the Houthis, They are inadvertently proving to the world that maritime shipping is vulnerable,
Wow.
which means they are actively handing the future of global trade logistics to China's land-based networks.
So the United States is trapped militarily by domestic politics and bleeding out economically in a way that directly enriches and empowers their biggest global rival.
That's the argument.
That is an incredibly bleak picture, which naturally brings us to a terrifying question.
Let's hear it.
When an empire feels that it is losing control of the conventional chessboard, losing the sea lanes, losing its economic leverage, how does it react? It looks for an ultimate trump card, ultimate security.
And in the realm of geopolitics, ultimate security has only one name:
Nuclear weapon.
nuclear weapons.
The source material dives deep into a reported, highly controversial arrangement between the United States and Saudi Arabia to push forward a Saudi domestic nuclear program.
Yes, it does.
And Wilkerson frames this as a deeply desperate move by everyone involved.
We really have to look at the motivations driving this.
Okay, let's break it down.
On the U.S. side, specifically under the leadership frameworks mentioned in the text, facilitating a Saudi nuclear program is viewed as a desperate, almost flailing attempt to maintain relevance in a region Southwest Asia and the Middle East, where U.S. influence is rapidly evaporating.
Because they can't protect the ships anymore.
Exactly. They can no longer guarantee security with aircraft carriers, so they are trying to buy loyalty by offering the ultimate bargaining tip, which is nuclear technology.
And what about Saudi Arabia? What is driving Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, to pursue this?
For MBS, it's partially about maintaining a transactional relationship with the United States. He likely sees the U.S. as a fading power, but it's still a dangerously heavily armed one.
True.
But the primary driver is regional balance and survival. Wilkerson states his belief that Iran likely already possesses a nuclear weapon.
Wait, already possesses one?
Yes. He argues they have the material, they have the knowledge, and they are simply waiting for the right moment to declare it or test it.
Wow.
Therefore, Saudi Arabia feels an absolute existential need to have their own indigenous nuclear capability. They don't want a security guarantee on paper from Washington.
They don't trust it.
No, and they don't want to borrow a bomb from Pakistan. They want their own centrifuges and their own warheads.
But I'm struggling to reconcile this with official policy. The source is suggesting that the United States might actively facilitate nuclear proliferation to a volatile Gulf state just to maintain a temporary geopolitical foothold.
That's the claim.
That completely contradicts decades of foundational American strategy. I mean, the bedrock of global security since the Cold War has been non-proliferation. Stopping the spread of these weapons is the one thing everyone used to agree on. How does the source explain this massive leap?
The source explains it by pointing to the sheer panic and the total lack of coherent long-term strategy in current U.S. leadership.
Panic policy.
Basically, providing Saudi Arabia with nuclear technology to counter a potential Iranian bomb is like trying to stop a house fire by handing your neighbor a flamethrower.
Right. Makes no sense.
You aren't creating a deterrent. You're just guaranteeing that when a conflict does spark, the collateral damage takes out the entire neighborhood. Wilkerson views this policy as throwing away the long-term survival of the human race for short-term geopolitical band-aids.
And he contrasts this current scramble for nukes with how things used to be handled. He looks back at the Obama-era JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, better known as the Iran nuclear deal.
Right. And it's important to remember how domestically controversial the JCPOA was in the U.S.
It was hugely controversial.
But from a purely analytical, strategic standpoint, Wilkerson praises it highly.
Really?
Yeah. The JCPOA traded economic sanctions relief for hard, verifiable caps on Iran's nuclear enrichment. Wilkerson calls that agreement 95 to 96% successful.
Which, in the messy world of international diplomacy, is practically a miracle.
It is a staggering success rate. It mechanically put a lid on the problem. It allowed inspectors in. It slowed the centrifuges down.
Wow.
Wilkerson actually mourns the lost era of the early 2000s, around 2002 and 2003, when there were serious, grounded discussions happening at the highest levels of the State Department about creating a comprehensive nuclear weapons-free zone across the entire Middle East.
Hearing that now feels like reading science fiction. It feels like a completely different reality.
It does. Because instead of a nuclear-free zone, the region is hurtling toward the exact opposite. And this is where Wilkerson outlines the truly grim calculus of what he calls the asymmetric nuclear reality in the Middle East.
Let's unpack this calculus, because when most people think of a nuclear standoff, they think of the Cold War, right?
Sure.
The U.S. and the Soviets Mutual assured destruction. If you shoot, I shoot, we both die, so nobody shoots. But Wilkerson says that logic doesn't apply here.
It doesn't apply at all because of pure geography and population density.
How so?
Wilkerson points out a terrifying mathematical reality. It would take exactly one nuclear weapon hitting a specific calculated point along the coastal plain between Tel Aviv and Haifa to essentially wipe the nation of Israel off the map as a functioning state.
Just one. Because it is a geographically small nation, and the vast majority of its population, its technology sector, its economy, is densely packed into a tiny sliver of land along the Mediterranean.
Exactly. One bomb ends the country. Conversely, Wilkerson argues, you could drop 30 nuclear weapons on Iran, and unless they were incredibly massive, multi-megaton thermonuclear devices, you would mostly just be blowing up granite mountains and empty desert.
Because Iran is huge?
Iran is a massive, sprawling country. Its population is widely distributed, and crucially, its military and nuclear facilities are deeply buried beneath the Zagros Mountains.
So in a nuclear standoff between Israel and Iran, or say a U.S.-backed Saudi Arabia and Iran, mutual assured destruction doesn't exist.
It doesn't.
Iran has a massive strategic advantage simply by virtue of its sheer size and topography. They can absorb a nuclear strike in a way their neighbors simply cannot.
Exactly. And when you factor in that Iran's economy and military are deeply integrated with China and Russia, the balance of power heavily favors Tehran in a nuclear standoff. Therefore, by helping Saudi Arabia develop nuclear capabilities, the United States isn't creating a stable balance of power. They are triggering a rapid, uncontrolled nuclear arms race across a region that is already locked in multiple proxy wars. Wilkerson calls it a situation that could go, quote, haywire in an instant.
It's a terrifying prospect, which brings us to a really uncomfortable underlying question here.
Okay.
If these policies are so clearly counterproductive, if they trap the U.S. militarily in unwinnable conflicts, if they bankrupt the country economically by losing control of the shipping lanes, and if they risk total nuclear Armageddon in the Middle East, why are they happening?
That is the big question.
What is the psychological driver behind these decisions?
So this is perhaps the most disturbing part of the analysis provided by Deason and Wilkerson.
All right, lay it on me.
They argue that to understand these seemingly irrational, self-destructive decisions, you have to realize that American foreign policy is no longer driven by cold strategic calculation, or even by economic self-interest.
What is it driven by then?
Hatred. Deep-seated, visceral, irrational hatred of rivals.
The source text actually uses that specific word, hatred.
Yes. Wilkerson explicitly states that policy is currently driven by a profound hatred for Russians, Persians, and Muslims.
Wow.
And he is very careful to emphasize that this is not a partisan issue. This is a bipartisan phenomenon that has infected the entire political class.
It's on both sides.
He cites politicians from both major parties to prove his point. He mentions Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, Democratic Senator Mark Warner, and former Democratic President Bill Clinton, arguing they all share this core driving animus.
He talks specifically about watching Senator Mark Warner speak, right? And being taken aback by the absolute venom in his voice when talking about Iran.
Right. Wilkerson argues that the United States no longer just wants to compete with these nations economically or technologically.
Well, deeper than that.
Much deeper. The establishment wants to take them out, to destroy them, simply because of who they are and because they dared to defy American unipolar dominance.
It's personal.
Exactly. He points out the absolute absurdity of this from a professional diplomatic standpoint. This is not how international relations are supposed to function. You don't make geopolitical policy based on personal loathing and emotional venom.
Because when policy is based on loathing, the normal rules of statecraft go out the window, don't they? Rationality disappears.
Completely.
And according to the source, this leads to the United States actively breaking its own rules and compromising its own security. Which brings us to Wilkerson's highly controversial claim about the NDAA.
Yes.
The National Defense Authorization Act.
Yes, and we must be very precise in how we break down this claim from the source because it is an explosive accusation.
Oh, yes, let's go slowly.
The NDAA is the massive, must-pass annual bill that funds the U.S. military. Wilkerson asserts that upcoming sections of this act, specifically citing sections 219 and 224, essentially legalize deeply problematic, dangerous, intelligence sharing practices with foreign allies.
And he compares these new legal provisions to a very specific, very dark chapter in U.S. intelligence history.
He does. He equates the mechanisms in these new NDAA sections to the actions of Jonathan Pollard.
Let's explain the Pollard case for those who might not know the history, because it's crucial context for Wilkerson's outrage here.
It's very important.
Jonathan Pollard was a civilian intelligence analyst working for the U.S. Navy in the 1980s. He had highly classified security clearances, and over a period of time, he smuggled suitcases full of top-secret documents out of his office and provided them to Israeli intelligence.
Right.
He was eventually caught, pleaded guilty to espionage, and spent decades in federal prison.
And the damage from Pollard's espionage was
Massive.
Wilkerson notes that it is widely believed within the intelligence community that some of that highly classified American intelligence methods, sources, satellite capabilities, which was given to Israel, ultimately ended up in the hands of the Soviet Union.
Wow.
It was one of the most devastating intelligence breaches of the Cold War.
So what is Wilkerson claiming the NDAA actually does?
Wilkerson is claiming that the U.S. Congress is now legally codifying, through sections 219 and 224, the very kind of unchecked intelligence sharing that was previously prosecuted as treason in the Pollard case.
That's a huge claim.
It is. He views this as a total sellout of American national security interests, driven by an irrational alliance structure that prioritizes foreign relationships over domestic security.
Again, we are detailing the source's stark, forceful claims here to illustrate their view of how deeply compromised and irrational they believe the system has become. But it's not just the United States that is acting irrationally, right?
No, it's not.
The analysis argues that U.S. allies are essentially participating in their own destruction by following Washington's lead.
Glenn Deason refers to these allied nations as vassal states.
Vassal states.
Yeah. He argues that nations in Europe, and particularly the allied Gulf states, are acting directly against their own basic survival instincts by fully subordinating their foreign policy to the United States.
Let's look at those Gulf states as an example. If this U.S.-Iran conflict continues to escalate, if the shipping lanes stay closed, if the nuclear posturing worsens and the U.S. fails to decisively defeat Iran, which Wilkerson has already argued is a mathematical impossibility, what happens to these U.S. allies in the region?
They face immediate existential threats.
Existential.
Yes. Without the absolute protection of a dominant U.S. military, these states are incredibly fragile. Wilkerson paints a very grim picture of the dominoes falling here.
What does that look like?
He suggests that if the regional security order collapses, we could see Kuwait absorbed by Iraq, orchestrated by heavily armed Iranian-backed militias moving south from Basra.
Wow.
He suggests that the monarchy in Bahrain, which is a Sunni dictatorship ruling over a majority Shia population, is extremely vulnerable to violent regime change.
Wow.
He mentions the Kingdom of Jordan erupting into total civil war.
It's just total chaos.
Yeah. By tying themselves to a failing, reactionary U.S. military strategy, these vassal states are turning themselves into prime targets.
So why do they do it? I mean, if following the leader means walking off a cliff, why don't these nations pivot? Why don't they negotiate their own security architectures?
Deason hits on a psychological concept here that is really profound.
What is it?
He calls it the loss of political imagination.
Political imagination. What did that look like when we actually had it?
Well, think back to the height of the Cold War. The U.S. and the Soviet Union possessed enough nuclear weapons to vaporize the planet 10 times over.
Right.
The ideological hatred was intense. But after the Cuban Missile Crisis, leaders like Kennedy and Khrushchev realized the system was just too fragile. So they used political imagination.
They got creative.
They did. They created the Washington-Moscow hotline. They negotiated arms control treaties. They tried to envision new architectures for peace. They basically asked, how do we manage this competition and harmonize our competing interests without going to war?
But today, Deason argues that capacity is just gone.
Completely gone. He argues that both the political leadership and the general public have completely lost that imagination. Success in foreign policy is no longer measured by stability, economic prosperity, or the harmonization of interests.
What's it measured by?
Success is measured purely by the absolute destruction of the rival.
He actually uses the term psychopathy, right?
He does.
He says society is starting to sound like psychopaths. We consume conflict like it's a sporting event. We look at body counts, we watch drone strike footage on social media, we cheer for the destruction of infrastructure, and we treat diplomacy like it's a dirty word.
Exactly. We have lost the ability to imagine a diplomatic solution, a compromise where everyone gets a little of what they want and nobody dies, because we are chemically addicted to the narrative of total victory. We want to annihilate the enemy, and we don't care about the collateral damage.
This is such a sobering critique of our collective psychology. I mean, think about how we all consume the news, right? Think about the comment sections you read under articles about foreign conflicts, or the rhetoric you hear from politicians demanding strikes and regime change.
It's everywhere.
The source is asking us to look in the mirror and ask, have we become so desensitized to violence that we've forgotten how to demand peace? Have we let our political imagination just atrophy?
And that lack of political imagination, that addiction to conflict and destruction, it sets the stage for the absolute climax of the source material.
Okay, here we go.
Because what happens when you mix broken, corrupt institutions, endless geopolitical warfare, and a total lack of diplomatic creativity with the undeniable physical reality of a rapidly changing planet?
You get a nightmare.
You do.
You get the 2065 war game and the terrifying reality of institutional decay. This is the part of the analysis that is truly haunting because it moves beyond theory and looks at hard environmental data.
Yeah, Wilkerson shares the details of a massive 2-year simulation run by the Center for Naval Analyses.
CNA.
Right. The CNA is a federally funded research and development center that provides deep, data-driven analysis for the Navy and the Marine Corps. This was a highly sophisticated war game focusing on the intersection of the climate crisis and global security.
And what did the simulation predict? What happens when the climate models intersect with these geopolitical models we've been discussing?
The simulation pinpointed the year 2065, though Wilkerson makes a point to note that given current acceleration, it could happen much, much sooner.
Okay, 2065.
The prediction was that as the climate crisis intensifies, causing massive systemic failures in agriculture and chronic water shortages across the global south, we will witness an unprecedented global migration event.
People moving to survive.
Massive, desperate waves of humanity will be forced to migrate north, simply to survive.
The demographic breakdown they outline in this war game is chillingly specific. They didn't just model people moving, they modeled exactly who would be moving and how they would be equipped.
Very specific. The simulation predicted that of these massive waves of migrants moving out of equatorial regions, half of them would be male.
Okay.
Of that male half would be under the age of 30. And of that young male demographic, half would be carrying Kalashnikov rifles and ammunition.
So this isn't a peaceful migration of climate refugees seeking asylum. This is a heavily armed, desperately violent fight for basic survival.
It's an army of desperation.
These are people marching toward the borders of the global north because they have absolutely nothing left to lose. They need water and they need food. And how did the global north, meaning the United States, Europe, China, Japan, the wealthy nations, how did they respond in this simulation?
In the war game, the result was universal and absolutely horrifying.
What happened?
Across the board, regardless of the political system of the northern nation from Tokyo to North America to the borders of Europe and China, the wealthy nations resorted to militarizing their southern borders and shooting people en masse.
Mass slaughter at the borders as official state policy.
Mass slaughter as a unified, desperate policy response to an overwhelming wave of armed starvation. And here's where we must connect the dots back to the earlier sections of our discussion. Remember, the economic blockades happening right now in the Red Sea.
The Houthis, the boarded-up kitchen window, the collapsing supply chains.
Right. Wilkerson points out that by shutting down global shipping, by spiking the cost of agricultural transit, by making fertilizer too expensive for developing nations to buy, we are actively starving the global south today.
Right now.
We are taking the baseline conditions of that 2065 war game, food insecurity, economic collapse, desperation, and we are violently accelerating them.
We are pulling the dystopian future forward into the present. We are manufacturing the exact crisis the Navy wargamed. But surely our institutions recognize this, right? The Pentagon, the military establishment, they ran the war game. They see the data. Are they preparing to handle this with some level of strategic foresight or ethical leadership?
This is where Wilkerson, speaking from the perspective of a man who devoted 50 years of his life to the American security establishment, delivers his most heartbreaking and cynical assessment.
Which is?
He laments the total ethical and moral collapse of the U.S. military institution.
He does not hold back, does he? He excoriates the leadership.
He says the ethical leadership required to navigate a crisis of this magnitude simply does not exist anymore. He describes the upper echelons of the military as a culture of sycophants.
Yes.
Exactly. He argues that flag officers, the highest-ranking generals and admirals, the people who are supposed to be the strategic adults in the room, are no longer motivated by duty, by military ethics, or by long-term national strategy.
What are they motivated by?
Corporate greed. Wilkerson argues their primary motivation is securing highly lucrative post-retirement board seats at massive defense contracting firms.
Follow the money. Always. Companies like Lockheed Martin, RTX, General Dynamics. They spend their military careers approving weapon systems and advocating for aggressive policies, knowing that when they take off the uniform, a multi-million-dollar corporate gig is waiting for them as a reward.
He calls the current military a corrupt, unethical instrument that executes violence without any meaningful objection from within its own ranks.
He does.
He actually says that he and his peers, the veterans who devoted their entire lives to building and serving this institution, they cannot believe they lived long enough to see it become this deeply contaminated.
It's a really profound sadness.
I have to interject here, though. Or rather, I want to pose a question that Deason actually raises toward the end of their conversation.
Go ahead.
If the system is this corrupt, if the military is captured by defense contractors, if the politicians are blinded by hatred, and if we are accelerating toward a violent climate migration, is a cataclysmic world war actually inevitable?
That's the million-dollar question. Does history require a massive destructive event to burn the old system down and force a reset of these broken institutions? Or is the source underestimating our human capacity to adapt and change course before we hit the edge of the cliff? Are we just locked into the 2065 border wars?
That is the ultimate existential question of our era. Deason notes a very dark historical pattern here.
What's that pattern?
Historically, unfortunately, it almost always takes a massive traumatic war to create new international institutions.
Right.
The League of Nations came out of the ashes of World War I. The United Nations and the Bretton Woods financial system came out of the absolute devastation of World War II. People seem to need to experience the horror firsthand, and to look into the abyss before they pursue common sense and diplomacy.
But Wilkerson points out the fatal flaw in relying on that historical pattern today.
The technology. We're not fighting with mustard gas or Sherman tanks anymore. We have thousands of nuclear weapons on hair-trigger alert. If we wait for a cleansing war to reset our broken institutions, we have the technological instruments to cleanse the planet of the human race entirely. We cannot afford the historical pattern of war, destruction, then rebuild.
Because there'd be nothing left.
Because a third world war would be final. There would be no one left to build the new institutions.
So we have to find another way. We have to rediscover that political imagination Deason was talking about. We have to figure out how to harmonize our interests without setting the world on fire.
Precisely. The stakes have literally never been higher.
Okay, let's take a deep breath.
Yeah, we need one.
We have covered an immense, overwhelming amount of ground today. We started with the tactical reality of an American F-35 obliterated in its hangar by perfectly timed zero-latency intelligence, proving the asymmetric advantage that Iran and its allies currently hold.
We covered a lot.
We moved to the Red Sea, realizing that the vital kitchen window of global trade has been boarded up by $20,000 drones, threatening worldwide supply chains, spiking inflation, and inadvertently supercharging China's dominance over global rail networks.
And then we explored the terrifying calculus of a nuclearizing Middle East. We looked at how a flailing U.S. establishment might actively push Saudi Arabia toward a nuclear bomb out of sheer geopolitical desperation, completely ignoring the asymmetric geographic reality of who actually survives a nuclear exchange in that densely populated region.
We looked into the dark heart of policymaking, examining how visceral hatred and animus have replaced rational strategy.
Right.
We discussed how controversial laws like the NDAA are allegedly legalizing the kind of intelligence betrayal we saw in the Pollard case, and how allied vassal nations are marching toward their own destruction because the entire system has lost its political imagination.
And we ended on the grim precipice of 2065. A deeply researched Navy war game predicting mass climate migration from the global south, met with mass border slaughter by the global north, all presided over by a military-industrial complex more interested in securing corporate board seats than providing ethical leadership.
It is a heavy, heavy analysis, but we need to remind ourselves why we took this journey. Why is it crucial for you listening right now to understand this specific perspective, even if it is deeply controversial, highly critical, or overwhelmingly bleak?
Because this isn't just abstract military theory meant for academics debating in a faculty lounge.
No, it's real life.
According to the analysis provided by Deason and Wilkerson, this is the literal blueprint for the economic and geopolitical reality of your life for the next 4 decades. The inflation you feel at your grocery store, the price of fuel your car, the stability of the global institutions you rely on. It is all tied directly to the choke points, the policies, and the institutional decay we discussed today. You cannot navigate the future, you cannot vote intelligently, and you cannot protect your own interests without understanding the massive geopolitical forces trying to shape that future.
Which brings us to our final thought for the day.
Yes. Throughout this entire analysis, the source material repeatedly lamented a deficit of political imagination. This tragic, fatal inability to envision a world that isn't based on Cold War-style dominance, zero-sum games, and the total destruction of rivals.
It's a bleak mindset.
So, as we wrap up, let's challenge that deficit. Let's use our imagination.
I love that.
If the unipolar era of American dominance is truly over, as Deason and Wilkerson claim, what does a radically different, peaceful geopolitical architecture actually look like?
It's a huge question.
If intermediate powers and everyday citizens refuse to accept the violent status quo of endless proxy wars and closed shipping lanes, what entirely new systems of global cooperation could be imagined to replace the ones that are currently failing us so spectacularly?
That is the question we all have to answer, and it's going to take all of our collective imagination to do it. Thank you for joining us on this intense, complex, deep dive. Keep questioning the consensus. Keep looking for the kitchen window in every conflict, and we will catch you next time.